The 5th century would see the end of the Roman Empire as we know it. Barbarian incursions, civil wars, and economic instability would lead the once great nation to its ruin. But was this truly inevitable? Or did there exist another possible future for the empire? Could a king amongst barbarian tribes, one who had sacked the city of Rome itself, possibly have led to the empire's restoration? Such a man truly did exist, one who, from wanting to stamp out the very name of Rome itself, would come to adore it, and attempt a great revival of the empire. This is the story of Athaulf the Visigoth, the barbarian who fell in love with Rome. The Goths were said by the Romans to belong to two distinct groups, the Ostrogoths, living in the east, and the Visigoths in the west. But to the Goths this was instead a tribal distinction, the Ostrogoths largely consisting of Greuthungi, while the Visigoths of the Thervingi. Around the year 370, 2 boys would be born in that latter tribe, Alaric and Athaulf. Alaric was said to have been born on Puce Island in modern-day Romania, and Athaulf was no doubt born close by. Alaric was a member of the Balthic dynasty, a Gothic word meaning bold, and his family were said to have ruled amongst the Thervingi since ancient times. The 2 young Goths must have bonded in their youths, a true friendship which would weather the turbulence of the coming age. In the year 376, their tribe, the Thervingi, would request permission to settle in the Roman lands across the Danube after a brutal invasion of their territory by the Huns the previous year. The Romans would strike a deal, allowing the Goths to settle in Thrace in return for their services in the military if Rome was to require it. But tensions mounted as food supplies dwindled. Unscrupulous officials happily carried off many Gothic treasures and even children, bound for slavery, in the desperate struggle of the Goths for survival. To attempt to rectify this troubling situation, the Gothic leaders led a delegation to the Roman garrison, but a fight broke out between the 2 factions, and one of the Gothic leaders was killed. The other, Fritigern, led the Goths in revolt, ravaging the province of Thrace, and killing even the Eastern Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople. This revolt was only put to rest when the new emperor, Theodosius, forged a new treaty in 382, one in which the Goths would be granted an autonomous stretch of land in Roman territory and receive yearly payments. In return, they would become subjects of Rome, and again were compelled to render military assistance. And so it was under these terms that Alaric and Athaulf would mature. To deepen their bond, Athaulf was given Alaric's sister in marriage, making him a new member of the Balthic dynasty. In the summer of 391, the now 20-year-old pair of Goths would finally take action, leading an army across the Balkans to ambush the Roman troops by the Hebrus. The Goths had little to no literary culture in this time. What we know of them comes exclusively from Roman sources. Thus, we will never know their motive for violating the Treaty of 382. In fact, Athaulf himself is barely mentioned in these early years, although he no doubt played a crucial role in the struggle, likely as a commander of the cavalry of Alaric's army. We can only speak of how they would affect the Romans, and in the case of this first clash, it would be devastating. The Romans were caught completely by surprise, and the emperor himself only barely managed to escape the melee. But this seems to have been a case of beginner's luck. Roman troops under the command of the half-Vandal Stilicho would soon encircle the Gothic forces. Surprisingly, instead of finishing the job, the emperor would instead have them released, an odd pattern which would continue throughout the Gothic campaigns. Many Roman historians blame this leniency on the emperor's traitorous assistants, either the barbarian Stilicho or the power-hungry consul Rufinus. It is, however, equally likely that the emperor saw these troops as a valuable asset. These at least somewhat Roman barbarians could be crucial in the defense against those far less sympathetic to the empire. Their usefulness would soon be proven when, in 394, they would form the vanguard of Theodosius's army at the Battle of the Frigidus, waged against the usurper Eugenius who wanted the throne for himself. They won a sound victory, but to the dismay of the Goths, they had been used as cannon fodder, and lost almost half their number while the Roman troops were virtually unscathed. After the death of Theodosius in 395, the Goths were discharged, and after discovering that their territory had been ravaged by the Huns in their absence, they could see that if they were to survive in the chaotic times to come, they would need to demonstrate to Rome just how seriously they should be taken. The death of Theodosius saw the Roman Empire divided for the final time. The east and west were split between his two sons Arcadius and Honorius. Stilicho would go to the west under Honorius, and Rufinus to the east under Arcadius. These two men were bitter rivals, and their fight for power would greatly enable the actions of the Goths in the coming years. Allegedly, Alaric first led his Goths to Constantinople to conduct a new treaty, where the traitorous Rufinus would assist them, hoping they would attack his rival in the west. Instead, they turned to Greece, overrunning Thermopylae and Piraeus. Stilicho mustered the combined forces of the empire, but those of the east were ordered back before an offensive could be launched. The Goths would continue on to sack the great cities of antiquity, Corinth, Argos, Olympia, and Sparta being just a few of many. Only Athens was spared, for as the historian Zosimus recounts, when Alaric advanced with all his forces against the city, he saw Athena, its tutelar goddess, walking along the wall, in the same form in which she is represented among the statues of the gods, which is in armor ready to attack those who oppose her. Before the walls he saw Achilles, standing in a heroic posture, such as that in which Homer represents him engaging the Trojans so furiously in revenge for the death of Patroclus. Alaric, being struck with awe by this sight, desisted from his attempt on the city, and sent heralds with proposals for peace. While this sight certainly may have awed him, there is little doubt that the generous gifts from the people of the city may have equally influenced his decision not to invade. The Goths would remain in Greece for more than a year until in 397 Stilicho finally returned to settle the matter. The Goths were encircled near Pholoe, but an agreement was again reached and they were released. Alaric would become a subordinate of Arcadius, likely appointed as Magister Militum per Illyricum, that is, Master of the Soldiers of Illyria, a position he had likely embarked on this campaign to obtain. This appointment must have greatly relieved Alaric's Goths at the time. This official position would no doubt guarantee their future, but this surety was not to last. The revolt of a Gothic general under Roman command soured their attitudes towards the people, seeking assistance instead from the dreaded Huns to put down his rebellion. With the Eastern Empire now no longer willing to negotiate, Alaric led his Goths west into the former heartland of the Roman Empire, Italy itself. In late 401, Alaric's Gothic army crossed the Julian Alps, almost unopposed. They would march on Milan, the now capital of the Western Empire, which was only barely able to lift their siege with the assistance of some Alan and Vandal mercenaries. The capital was thence moved to Ravenna, a port town which would be much more difficult to encircle. The Goths moved west, setting up camp near the small town of Palenzo. On the Easter Sunday of 402, Stilicho would launch a surprise attack on the camp. Much of the Gothic loot and quite a few of their infantry were lost, but the cavalry, likely under Athaulf's command, were mostly preserved, and the Goths managed to drive back Rome's Alanic mercenaries and kill their commander, bringing the battle to a draw. From here the Goths seemed to have made plans to retreat, heading back east, but for reasons known only to them instead stopped near the city of Verona. A second battle was fought much like the first, and the Goths withdrew to the mountains. But Stilicho had anticipated this retreat and blockaded the road north, trapping the Goths yet again. Food was running out, and many chose to abandon the campaign. One such man was Sarus, likely a descendant of Gothic nobility, who chose to defect to the Roman side. We are told of an immense hatred between Athaulf and Sarus, although its cause is never stated. Stilicho soon struck a deal with the desperate Goths, and had Honorius declare Alaric as Magister Militum per Illyricum, a privilege he clearly could not have, as Illyria was, at this time, under Eastern control. Stilicho had designs on the east, but further barbarian invasions in the coming years would see his plans unable to be realized. An even greater threat would soon appear. Constantine III would declare himself emperor. Stilicho led Alaric and the Goths against him, but their campaign was largely unsuccessful, and the Goths were never paid the gold they had demanded in return. Around this time, Athaulf would be sent to Pannonia, likely to replenish the cavalry that the Goths had lost at Verona. The failure of Stilicho and the Goths to deal with this usurper turned the people of Rome against them, and in late 408 Stilicho was executed, and the Goths living throughout the empire found themselves under immense persecution. These disenfranchised Goths flocked to Alaric's army. It is estimated that almost 30,000 would join, almost 12,000 of whom were the elite troops that had formerly served Stilicho. One of the few Goths to stay with the Romans was Sarus. Perhaps there was already too much bad blood for him to return. Alaric took this opportunity to attempt a negotiation, but this newly anti-Gothic empire wanted none of it. And so, without even waiting for Athaulf and his cavalry to join him, Alaric cut straight into Italy. In just a month he stood before the gates of Rome. It was now besieged and cut off from all supplies. Famine and plague ravaged the city. Alaric demanded that Honorius declare an alliance between the Goths and Romans, as well as requesting a generous tribute. The emperor seemed to agree, and the Goths retreated to Tuscany. But this was an empty promise, and Honorius raised an army of 6,000 Dalmatian mercenaries to drive the Goths away. However, they would quickly find themselves ambushed and were easily dispatched. Athaulf now led his cavalry to reunite with his brother-in-law. He suffered a setback at the city of Pisa, but nevertheless would soon arrive. Alaric now demanded the provinces of Noricum and Venetia, a military title, annual payment, and a supply of grain for his Goths, but these demands were all refused. He compromised, asking only for the Norican provinces and the grain, but he was yet again rebuffed, the Romans seeing his compromise as a sign of weakness. Frustrated with Honorius's refusal to negotiate, Alaric chose a senator by the name of Attalus to become the new emperor. Attalus thus appointed Alaric as commander-in-chief, and Athaulf as commander of cavalry. But despite the Goths forming his only real backing, Attalus seems to have been largely dismissive of them, appointing anti-Gothic senators to high offices, and refusing to allow the Goths to retake the African provinces, crucial for the empire's food supply. He was soon stripped of his office by the frustrated Goths, but nevertheless kept under Gothic protection. Alaric now attempted to once again negotiate with Honorius, and this stunt with the new emperor seems to have finally gotten through to him. The two would meet just outside Ravenna to come to terms. But just at this moment, Athaulf would encounter Sarus with a small band of men to the south, and seize the opportunity to attack him. Why this occurred during peace talks is unclear. Perhaps Athaulf had not received news of the meeting, or perhaps his hatred of Sarus was simply too great to ignore. Regardless, Sarus led his men in retreat straight towards the meeting, ambushing Alaric's troops, and negotiations instantly broke down yet again. Left with no other choice, Alaric would once more lead his Goths towards Rome, but this time with a grim resolution. Not since the time of Brennus nearly 800 years earlier, when Rome was still in its infancy, would the Eternal City see the level of devastation that the Goths were about to unleash. On August 24th, 410 AD, Alaric and his Goths would sack the city of Rome. The Goths ransacked the city, terrorizing the population and looting anything they could carry off. Ancient historians, however, claim there existed at least a certain level of moderation. The newly converted Goths would not harm those taking shelter within the basilicas of St. Peter and Paul. In fact, many Christian authors of the time largely downplayed the severity of the sack, well aware of how it may appear to the populace that the Eternal City itself had been sacked less than 20 years after the worship of the Roman gods had been outlawed. This was, in fact, the very inspiration for St. Augustine's City of God, a book that would become a cornerstone of the Christian tradition. But it is doubtful that the citizens of Rome themselves would have viewed the sack in such positive terms. We hear one account of an old woman accosted by Goths, demanding her to give up her gold. The impoverished woman had none, but only after beating her with cudgels would the Goths accept this answer. She was afterwards brought to the church, but her injuries were already too severe. During the course of the siege, Galla Placidia, the sister of Honorius, would be taken hostage by Athaulf, an occurrence that would drastically alter the course of his life. After 3 days, the Goths finally left the city and traveled south. They attempted a crossing to Sicily, likely heading for the fertile provinces of Africa. But according to legend, they were prevented from doing so by a sacred statue on the other shore. By 1 foot of the statue was a holy flame, protection against the fires of Mount Etna, and by the other a pool of water, protection against barbarian invasions by sea. A great storm arose, preventing the Gothic crossing, and so they chose to return north. This journey had only just begun when Alaric, the first king of the Visigoths, passed away from illness. He was said to have been buried near the town of Cassentia. Knowing that the Romans would no doubt ransack his grave and desecrate his body in their absence, the Goths chose to conceal its location. They diverted the course of the Bicento River, placing his body beneath its bed before returning the flow, permanently concealing Alaric's grave under the torrent. It was now time for the Goths to elect a new king, and they would choose for themselves the right-hand man and brother-in-law of Alaric. They bestowed the kingdom of the Visigoths on Athaulf, a man of imposing beauty and great spirit, for though not tall of stature, he was distinguished for beauty of face and form. So begins the reign of Athaulf. Still reeling from the sack of Rome, there survives little record of the devastation of the following year, the first of Athaulf's new kingship. We know only that many Romans would flee the peninsula, decrying the brutality of these former slaves and their barbarian king. This must have been the time that Athaulf would later speak of, in which he longed to replace Romania with Gothia and become what Caesar Augustus had once been. But by his side in this turbulent time was Galla Placidia, the sister of the Western Emperor Honorius. Athaulf is said to have appreciated her nobility, beauty, and chaste purity, and she must have in this time begun to teach him of the empire, instructing him on its history, laws, and customs. And as he learned, his feelings towards the empire slowly began to change. During the chaos of 411, yet another usurper would make himself known, Jovinus, who would, with the help of some Alans and Burgundians, declare himself emperor in Gaul. He is said to have courted an alliance with Athaulf, the new leader of the vicious Goths. After receiving the advice of Attalus, the former emperor, Athaulf decided to take Jovinus up on his offer, going to meet with him in Gaul. But oddly, this seems to have infuriated Jovinus, claiming to have been offended by Athaulf's presence. The chasm between the two parties would only widen. Each would take further actions that greatly offended the other. Athaulf caught wind of an interesting occurrence. Sarist had fallen out with Honorius and was on his way to join Jovinus's ranks. Athaulf led an army of 10,000 men to apprehend Sarist's meager band of 28, and so his most hated enemy was finally captured and executed. This incensed Jovinus, who chose to name his brother-in-law as co-emperor without any consultation from the Gothic king. For this slight, Athaulf would turn to Honorius, whose supporters promised to allow Gothic settlement in the lands of Gaul in return for assistance in dealing with the traitor. Jovinus would soon be captured by Athaulf, and his head would be mounted on the walls of Ravenna. But the emperor's guarantees proved yet again to be worthless, as he now demanded the return of his sister before the agreement could be carried out. This was no doubt due, at least in part, to the urging of his new general Flavius Constantius, who desperately wanted the emperor's sister for himself. Athaulf was incensed, and thrust his army into southern Gaul, seizing the cities of Narbonne, Toulouse, and Bordeaux. An attempt was also made to capture Marseille, but in the course of the siege Athaulf was grievously wounded and forced to retreat. He would instead turn his attention south towards Spain, warring with the Vandals who now occupied its lands, and thus laying the groundwork for the future Visigothic kingdom. In these few years, Athaulf found himself growing closer and closer to Galla Placidia, and consequently to Rome itself. There is no further mention of his supposed wife, Alaric's sister. She had likely passed away some years prior. Thus, Athaulf was free to remarry, and in 413, he would announce his engagement to Galla Placidia, the sister of Honorius. This enraged the emperor and his new general. They immediately ordered her return, but Athaulf, with no desire to give up his bride, demanded an impossibly large tribute of grain, one that he knew the Roman Empire could never provide. And so, at the beginning of the following year, the marriage would go ahead. With the assistance of Candidian, the marriage of Athaulf with Placidia was celebrated at the beginning of January in the city of Narbo, in the house of Ingenius, one of its most distinguished citizens. Placidia sat in the inner room dressed in Roman fashion and in royal robes. Athaulf was by her side, wearing a woolen tunic and Roman clothing. Amongst other wedding presents, Athaulf gifted his bride 50 beautiful youths dressed in silk, each bearing in his hands 2 very large dishes, one filled with gold, the other with precious, or rather priceless, stones, the spoils of Rome when it was sacked by the Goths. Then wedding songs were sung, Attalus leading the chorus, accompanied by Rusticius and Phoebadius. The ceremony ended with great demonstrations of joy and games, in which Romans and barbarians alike took part. The truly Roman nature of this wedding demonstrates just how much Athaulf's attitude towards the nation had changed. If there were any other doubt, it was here too that he would deliver his most famous speech, one which would cement his legacy. I, at first, was ardently eager to blot out the Roman name, and to make the entire Roman Empire that of the Goths alone, and to call it and make it, to use a popular expression, Gothia instead of Romania, and that I, Athaulf, would become what Caesar Augustus had once been. When, however, I discovered from long experience that the Goths, by reason of their unbridled barbarism, could not by any means obey laws, nor should the laws of the state be abrogated, without which the state is not a state, I chose to seek for myself the glory of completely restoring and increasing the Roman name by the forces of the Goths, and to be held by posterity as the author of the restoration of Rome, since I have been unable to be its transformer. These ambitions would receive a great boon as Galla Placidia soon fell pregnant, and in 415 she would give birth to a son, named by the pair Theodosius, in honor of Placidia's father who had, in the Gothic view, been almost like a friend, and had been more than willing to make peace with the Goths. The Emperor Honorius had no children of his own, and so the child would, if no mishaps were to occur, go on to inherit the Western Empire itself, and lead to the fulfillment of Athaulf's grand dreams. Constantius was fuming. This was precisely the position he had wanted for himself. He immediately moved to cut off the Goths' supplies, forcing them to retreat from southern Gaul into Spain. But this was just the beginning of the tragedy for the Goths, and perhaps that of Rome as well. The newborn Theodosius would pass away from illness just a few months later. Of course, while this must have devastated the pair, the situation was still by no means unsalvageable. After all, Placidia was still young. There was no doubt still plenty of time to produce a new heir and overthrow Constantius. This comeback, however, would never have a chance to occur, as around August of the same year, Athaulf would meet his end. It was said to have occurred while Athaulf was inspecting the stables alongside his retainers. A man by the name of Eberwulf was among them. He was a former servant of Sarus who had gone to Athaulf's side after his master's defeat. But rather than attempt to reconcile with the man, Athaulf instead incensed him even further, frequently mocking him for being short. It was on this day that Eberwulf would seize his chance to avenge these two great offenses, and Athaulf's dream of a Roman revival would be snuffed out forever. On his deathbed, Athaulf is said to have ordered his brother to bring Galla Placidia back to Rome, and to urge the Goths to cultivate friendship with the Romans. But he would never get the chance, as the brother of Sarus, Sigeric, would seize the throne, and begin a bloody purge. All of Athaulf's children by his former wife were killed, likely alongside his brother, as he is never spoken of again. Galla Placidia managed to preserve her life, but did not escape humiliation, as she was forced to walk as a captive in front of Sigeric's horse. She would go on to marry Constantius, and their son would be the next emperor. Sigeric's reign of terror lasted for 7 days, until finally being cut down by Wallia, the next Visigothic king. The death of Athaulf can truly be seen as a tragedy, perhaps even more so for Rome than for the Goths. The Western Roman Empire is generally said to have fallen in 476, roughly 60 years later. The Visigoths would finish at least some of what Athaulf had started, carving out from the territory he had led them to the Visigothic kingdom, one which would survive long after Rome itself, and whose people would shape the future of the peninsula. But never again would another man seek to carry out his true vision, a great union of Roman and Goth, and a total renaissance of the empire. Of course, even had Athaulf never been assassinated, it's impossible to say whether his dream could have truly come to fruition. Nevertheless, there remains in his story a tantalizing glimpse into this possible future, a grand renewal of the empire by the barbarian who fell in love with Rome. This was my very first video, and the future of this channel is still very much uncertain, so if you enjoyed it, liking the video would be greatly appreciated, and consider subscribing if you're interested in watching my future videos. If there's a person in particular who you think I should make a video about, leave their name in the comments for me to consider. Other than that, thanks for watching.